Hello, and welcome to The Candid Companion, an all-new podcast hosted by myself, Zuzu Gabrielli, and my beautiful co-host, Cleo Constantine.
Hi, everyone.
We are two Berlin-based independent sex workers, and we're here to talk to you about sex, our lives, politics, legislation, our relationships, the things that affect us, and our thoughts about the sex industry.
And to those of you who know us from our previous podcast, which was called Business or Pleasure, I just want to say welcome back and thank you for coming with us. So some of you might be wondering, why the rebrand? We had some issues with our previous producer, and that led to us realizing that we wanted to make this podcast completely independently. We didn't want anybody else being in control or having any mediation over our image or anything that we were putting out there. We wanted to be completely in control. And we learned a lot of valuable lessons from Business or Pleasure. Especially learned not to give your content away for free.
Don't give away your content for free.
And that's why we're starting this new project. It's going to be completely created by us, directed and produced by us, and we are currently collecting donations via GoFundMe. So that's on our Twitter, and it will be on our new website. We have pinned it onto both of our tweets, on top of our Twitter. It's there, on our profile.
And please consider donating, as these costs are going to help us run the show. It is a lot of work, and we really appreciate your donations.
And we love making this show.
Yeah, we're really excited to start this new project. And we feel that even in the last year and a half that we've been doing this, that we've matured spiritually, not physically. We're more unapologetic and more bitchy than ever before, if that's possible, and more candid. So a warm welcome to all you new listeners.
And those of you who are coming from Business or Pleasure, thanks for staying with us. Thanks for tuning in.
You're the best. So why do we do this podcast? We don't create this podcast as a means of advertising for us, although we have received a good deal of bookings from Business or Pleasure, from podcasting, which is very flattering. Thank you very much. I love walking into a booking and having a client tell me that they've been listening to my podcast. We are more interested, however, in sharing knowledge about the sex industry. We're passionate about this, and we are excited to interview people we think have unique and relevant perspectives, and that's definitely coming up on our brand new season. We have a lot of interviews.
Yes.
And we want to do more.
This season is a lot more political than the previous one, and there's a lot of theory. And we've done this because, sex workers are getting eradicated from the internet at the moment. We are getting censored left, right, and center. We are getting our accounts deleted on Facebook, on Instagram. We are getting severely limited in how much of an audience we can reach on Twitter. And so we think it's more important than ever that our voices are heard, especially after Sesta Foster, which we will talk about later in the season. There have been law changes that are meaning that sex workers are being silenced more than ever.
One of the things we want to do on this podcast is challenge some of the many misconceptions that exist about sex workers. There are two polarizing views of sex work that we experience. One, that it is incredibly abject and demeaning work, and the other is that it's very high class and very glamorous.
The first view, it's mainly held by the general public, religious people, Hollywood, second wave feminists, the whole idea of a drug addicted or a desperate woman who has absolutely no agency and
is unable to find more dignified work.
Exactly, and that it's not seen as valid or meaningful work, or that it is work at all.
And for example, the idea that men can do whatever they want to us once they pay us, that we in effect trade our consent for money. And I myself held this view as a teenager before I entered the sex industry.
I definitely did too.
So yeah, we definitely think it's important to challenge this, as that is absolutely not our experience. And as sex workers, we practice boundaries all the time and negotiate boundaries constantly.
And both of us have talked about this many times, that working in the sex industry is what has made us have extremely strong boundaries in our lives. And it was working in the sex industry that gave me these skills in setting boundaries and negotiating with people.
And the second misconception of sex work, that it's high class and glamorous. I mean, we both watched Secret Diary of a Call Girl, I think,
Yes.
when we were teenagers.
I read the book as well.
Yeah, and that perception is also widely held on Twitter, Twitter is currently the largest online platform where sex workers can still freely express themselves and be visible, share information about sex work. There's really a whole world, a whole sex work bubble on Twitter. Many of you probably found us on Twitter. You can book escorts from Twitter and kind of get a sense of our personalities and see a lot of selfies. It's really the new way, I think, post Backpage, that people can find sex workers, and it's very addictive. So definitely check it out.
However, because of Twitter, there is this pressure to present yourself in a certain way, in a certain class bracket, shall we say.
Because it is, at the end of the day, it is advertising.
Yes.
There's a lot of great information being shared on Twitter about screening and about, what makes a good client, etc. However, it is, at the end of the day, a means of advertising.
And because of that, there's a lot of pressure on Twitter to put yourself forward as high class, as educated, wealthy, or like you have a day job and you're just doing this for fun, that you're a nymphomaniac. And I think that the reality of our jobs lies somewhere in between.
Yeah, you see a lot of expensive handbags on Twitter and like jet-setting vacation photos. Louboutins. And, we don't fault sex workers for doing this because, of course, advertising is important. And unfortunately, when you posit yourself as somebody who has a lot of money, you attract people with money. That's just the way the world works. And I don't know, CEOs, international CEOs want to be with wealthy escorts, whatever the reason. There is this I remember when I first joined Twitter, and I was quite critical because I saw, all these photos of these, glamorous escorts and, talking about how they would never see someone who didn't send their, LinkedIn and ID, like
4-hour minimum.
4-hour minimum, just, and I was like, okay, that's great. I'm so happy for you. However, this doesn't reflect like sex work as a whole, was my first impression. However, as I've been on Twitter for about 2 years now, I do realize that I think it does positively affect change, and like, I think information sharing is important, and that sometimes the idealized things I see on Twitter do have an effect in real life, or, trickle down to real life.
I think that Twitter has definitely positively humanized sex workers. I think there have been some really interesting movements through Twitter. For example, there was an activist, Tilly Lawless, 5 years ago, who made a hashtag Faces of Prostitution, which was where a lot of workers were taking selfies of themselves and posting them on Twitter to show, look, I'm just an ordinary person, here's my selfie. So I think that while there is this like pressure to come across as super high end, there's also a humanizing element of all of it.
And as you did say correctly, that the reality of sex work in our experience does fall somewhere in the middle. And, there's a lot of pressure in the industry when you are a sex worker to distance yourself from more marginalized workers, from people who are more abject, in order to empower your position or to, posit yourself as more high class. We don't want to do that on this podcast. At the end of the day, we are all having sex for money, and issues of stigma and legislation affect all of us to varying degrees. And we just want to align ourselves with more abject workers because what concerns us is legislation, and we want a lot of change.
Yeah, and being a sex worker is a political identity first and foremost. It's a label that has a political organizing history. This has always been a dangerous job. It's always been a marginalized job for women. It's made up almost exclusively of women, although people of all genders do sex work. But, trans women especially are especially vulnerable to stigma and violence. And we don't want to, while we acknowledge our privilege, we do not want to distance ourselves from marginalized workers.
Yes, many women do sex work because they do have no other option, and their financial need is so great that they can't turn down work, and that makes them vulnerable. We acknowledge our privilege because we are white, we're cisgendered, and that we could do other work if we really wanted to. Not everybody has this option. So while we acknowledge our privilege, we don't want to disassociate from workers who, are drug users, or workers who are working day to day as a means of survival, because we are all doing the same job and our political interests are the same.
So this podcast has given me a lot of life. In what way has it been important for you?
It's been so important for me to kind of collect my thoughts about sex work, and, even for someone like myself, who I'm very much out to all of my family and friends, I don't have a problem telling people I'm a sex worker. However, I don't tell everybody I'm a sex worker. It's not something casually that you can tell a stranger, even somewhere like Berlin, which is a fairly open-minded and abject city, if you will.
Sexy.
Yeah, you can't do this without subjecting yourself to a lot of inappropriate questions or speculations, even in spaces like the queer scene, where people, tend to be more open-minded. It's important for me I like to have this podcast to direct people who have questions about sex work. It's kind of a tool that, I had somebody ask me recently about my position on harm reduction, and I was able to direct them to a certain episode of ours. What about you?
I think for myself, we started making this podcast 1.5 years ago, and I was finding that I had so much to say, and I didn't have somewhere to put it all so succinctly. I had a lot to say about my experiences of sex work, and about that the stigma and misconceptions are harmful and just inaccurate. And I really needed a place to put all of this. So I was really happy that I have this podcast to be able to dispel a lot of the stigma, and also just obviously to meet up with you like several times a week. And also that we have this really special and interesting dynamic, and it's really great that we're able to work together. And I think who better than us?
It's true. We really empower each other, and we're extremely fierce.
It's true.
We're extremely fierce women, and we're feminists. And I mean, we come from kind of a very different side of feminism. We haven't always held these views, and we've come a long way. And yeah, I really enjoy being able to bounce ideas off of you in this podcast. The fight for sex worker rights is definitely a big priority for both of us, and we recognize that these are very crucial times for sex workers. And because of the secrecy and stigma around sex work, it's hard to know how to talk about us, how to approach us, and how to be a good ally.
And I think that we want to posit ourselves first and foremost as experts of sex and experts in our own needs. And that we should be the ones who are consulted about these issues that affect us. We believe that we are experts on consent, on sexual technique, on sexually transmitted diseases, and so on. And making this podcast is part of putting something out there that says, this is us, and this is what we think. And come to us and listen to us.
We want to be included and consulted in legislation around sex work, and to be a part of the decision-making process, because as we will discuss, there are so many bad laws around sex work that exist. There's no perfect political model that addresses our needs and is well suited for, the kind of work that we do. So we definitely want to have our voices heard more on an institutional level. But as it stands, we're often left out of these kinds of conversations, regardless of the fact that no one knows our needs better than ourselves.
So we have a lot to say, clearly. This podcast is one way that we are insisting that we're heard. Thank you so much for listening. Please stay tuned and please donate to this project. You can find us on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @Cleo Constantine. That's @CleoConstantine.
And my Twitter is @Zuzu Gabrielli. That's @ZUZUGABRIELLI. Thanks for listening and stay tuned.